Hi, everybody. Good morning.
Hey.
Day one of CES 2025. I don't know how we got to 2025. I felt like we were just in 2024 like 10 seconds ago. A little bit of vacation and then boom, we're all here in Vegas. I think this is going to be probably one of the most interesting years if you think about it. Many friends have said, well, if Trump gets elected, we're going to be in a state where advertising is going to boom. But obviously, we just heard from Brian, like there are a bunch of negative factors that are going to potentially impact us. Anything from more inflation, tariffs, who knows what's going to happen with taxes. So I thought, since we're sitting here at the very beginning of 2025 and we have an amazing panel, and obviously, Brian, you can sort of expound on it. If we go to the question of what does ad spend look like? What does marketing investment look like? Starting in 2025, starting right now this quarter, and predicting through, obviously, inauguration on, I think, January 20th, and then looking at Q4 of this year. What's your predictions for this year?
Yeah, I think at a macro level, there's a little bit of uncertainty. The shoe is on the other foot now. So obviously, a lot of people, and there's a degree of volatility relative to the new political regime. And I think people feel, a lot of brand marketeers, I think, are saying steady as she goes. We had a lot of momentum coming out of 23 and 24 particularly, but I think there's a degree of early uncertainty while the new administration fully takes foot. And of course, it's going to vary by vertical, isn't it? It's going to vary by category. So dependent on tariffs, one of the big sort of issues, which could obviously impact certain categories. Brian has very eloquently talked about maybe pharma being under scrutiny in the fourth quarter. That could obviously affect that category. But generally, I think there is reason. I always say, look to the consumer, look to consumer sentiment and business sentiment. So business sentiment is a little bit on the fence at the moment, but consumer sentiment, I think, feels reasonably positive. So I think that's a really good indicator.
Brian? And then I'll go to Jeff.
Oh, so I think that the tone is, I mean, uncertainty has been persistent for a long time. Like when the Russia invaded Ukraine, you kept hearing narratives around market uncertainty. I think all that happened was where there were excuses to refrain from making commitments or decisions until the last possible minute. That was what happened. The spending was still going to show up. The budgets were still there because the underlying economy was still like actually pretty good, at least in the US. And now you did have the industry kind of talk itself into a bit of a real slowdown in the fourth quarter of 2022, if you'll remember. But the underlying conditions were really positive. I think that I don't have a reason to believe that marketers are going to talk themselves into a downturn, but it's not, and that's why my numbers are still net positive. They look normal in a historical sense of growth, right, for an ad market. And I don't think that there's no reason to say that marketers are just going to evaporate their budgets unless the supply chain thing is a meaningful thing, or if the kind of chaos that is possible happens. And I can imagine if, just taking, these aren't even extremes, to say the Gulf of America gets, Gulf of Mexico, now the Gulf of America, and all sorts of things happen that just cause all sorts of chaos. You can imagine these things happening. They're not out of the realm of, they're not crazy. And you can imagine business reacting very negatively. I'm not expecting that, but we can't rule it out either.
I mean, Jeff, you're in a unique place only because if you think about MSNBC, CNN, they were all pretty much, left-leaning. Fox, as the sort of other side of the scale, with the election and obviously the overwhelming sort of majority voting for the new administration, you're in a really interesting spot because it used to be at least perceived in sort of, I guess, on the East and West Coast that you're the outlier. And I think now pretty much everybody sort of sees you as the representing the majority, I guess, in terms of Fox sort of viewpoints. How are you seeing that sort of affect business, and what are you seeing from a momentum perspective, even here at CES?
So we feel pretty good about where the market's going right now. Again, always a little cautious around the volatility. In terms of overall Fox News and just the demand that we've been seeing, I think, listen, it's been a very, very active news cycle. I think the ratings have been, demonstrative of that. I think the country is just completely, again, from a news standpoint, very, very interested in what's happening right now. I think we wouldn't necessarily consider Fox News to be in one part of the country, whether it's middle of the country or left coast or right coast. I think that audience has always been representative of the entire country. So yes, with the new administration coming on in, news viewership patterns tend to change with time. You've seen CNN and MSNBC sort of drop off pretty dramatically post-election. I suspect post-inauguration, you're going to see some of those networks start to get buoyed back up again as sort of resistance networks to the current administration. So, but overall, we're very, very pleased with the overall demand that we're seeing on the news side, and also the amount of advertisers that have come back into news. You will get on occasion a couple of advertisers, a handful that will pull out pre-election and then wait until the election goes over, just again, uncertainty. Those advertisers have all come back in a big way. And I think, to your point, I think they're recognizing that the country has spoke.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're touching on a point, which is, and when I'm really talking about left coast, right coast, as well as center, we're really talking about is sort of the taboo of leaning into sort of conservative voices, right? Like I think there has been a taboo of leaning into, at least for some corporations, there's been this sort of left-leaning, more left-leaning sentiment that, you're supporting certain demographics versus others. The election, I think, was a wake-up call on some level in terms of, if you look at the majority of at least the voters, sort of where sentiment lies. The question, I think, for the whole group, and we're going to get into a much more precise thing that we were talking about in the panel around brand safety, but the question, I think, going down, starting from the group, is how has this last election, in terms of the larger vote, changed how marketers think about expectations of where and how media runs, and what is taboo and what is not taboo? Are we seeing a shift in sentiment of expectations in terms of directives coming from the client to the agencies on here's where we want to run our media, here's what used to be considered potentially off limits or potentially, hot topics, and those are no longer off limits, no longer hot topics, because they don't represent the broader sort of voice of America, at least as we understand it today.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think Paul can certainly talk to what clients are saying to agencies, but from our perspective, our experience with clients has been that they look for audiences, and they're trying to find the audiences wherever they are. And what Fox News has done, and done for a really long time, is reach audiences on both sides. It reaches more Democrats than any other news organization. It reaches more independents, and it reaches more Republicans. So it is very representative. So we haven't really had the issue of people not buying because it's sort of center right or too far to the right. It's really people just either not buying news at all, which is a legitimate issue out there. That's probably the biggest one that we have at this point.
Yeah, I think we sometimes overemphasize the moment. Let's just reflect back on, there've been political change over the last decades. And this topic comes up every time there's a new regime, And so let's remember it's about consistency. And I agree with Jeff. I think a lot of clients are obviously, particularly, there can be some very pointed political issues, and we're going to talk about brand safety and things like that, and those are really important topics. But let's remember it's about consumers, consumer behavior, and that evolves somewhat slowly over time. It has sped up because of technology and things like that. So keep your eye on the ball. Don't preoccupy yourself with the latest headline over political change, and maybe that's going to mean that there's less. Of course, we know there'll maybe be more deregulation. There may be more consolidation. M&A activity will probably happen. That could be good for certain categories. It might be bad for certain agencies if you happen to be on the wrong side of a consolidation. But that has always happened, hasn't it? It's just it goes in peaks and troughs. be careful of the hype news cycle versus the long-term trends about consumers following the eyeballs, following what they're doing, how behavior is changing, what is the patterns behind that change, and keep your eye on the important ball. And that's what I think the guidance is, because in 2 or 3 months' time, it'll be back to the new normal, wasn't it? Remember, we were using that under COVID, the new normal. What was the new normal? It was like, it's the normal, because we go through these peaks and troughs of either political issues or, by the way, COVID could happen again. You don't know what's around the corner, let alone anything else. So keep your eye on the ball, and I'll talk about that in predictions later. But Brian.
Yeah, I mean, a couple thoughts. Prior to January 6, 2021, I started doing some research on the consequences of polarization in advertising and what it meant. And the research I did was I talked to people who were around and or had direct knowledge of what happened to advertising in Quebec in the 1970s, around the time of secession, the first secession vote, or leading up to it, in Ireland during the Troubles, and in Spain pre-Franco, like immediately, yes, there was advertising in Spain in the 1930s, and I thought it would be interesting, like, what were marketers doing? And there actually are like historians and who've got like work in Spain on this stuff. So long story short is one of my former Irish colleagues described it prior to the series coming out. He said, Brian, have you ever heard of a poem, whatever you say nothing? That's what marketers did during the Troubles. They basically tried to avoid being around touching it whatsoever. And the same was basically true in Quebec. Like, no one wanted to touch, like, should Quebec secede or not? And people just ignored politics as much as it could in Spain in the 30s. And so the thing that occurred to me was that what was different then was, going into January 6, 2021, immediately after, was the world of social media. You can't control your brand narrative anymore in the way that you could have then. That's the difference. Because the thing that struck me was, I'm sure a lot of us remember the video of, there was a video of like some of the Irish protesters, whatever you want to call them, celebrating at the Hyatt. And so in my mind was like, tired after a long day storming the Capitol? Come celebrate our happy hour at the Hyatt, where Hyatt offers you this. Hyatt will give you drinks especially if you're anti. Okay, the point is your brand gets hijacked. And I think every year you should expect that of the top 100 brands, I don't know, are there 100 brands here? Probably more than that. 5 of you this year will have some kind of politicized problem this year, whether you like it or not. And the question will be, what do you already stand for? If there are things that really matter to you, and it doesn't matter if there is, it's not a political statement to say this. There could be things that you're for or against or whatever your brand truly stands for. You have to have invested in whatever those things truly are, like the 2 or 3 really, really important things your brand really, really cares about. Because you won't have control over whether or not, like again, the idea of if your ads run in an environment where something that's contrary to what your brand stands for occurs, you'll get called out now. And the thing that matters, I think, is that you're at least consistent with whatever it is your brand stands for. I'm not saying what it should stand for, but you want to be consistent, because you'll be in a better position when, not if, circumstances play out that someone tries to hijack your brand in this more polarized environment where everything, anyways.
Okay, so I want to talk about 2 quick things, and we got to get to predictions because I want to make sure that we have enough time for predictions. I've asked these gentlemen to give us 3 key predictions for this year, and that's going to eat up a bunch of time. But what I do want to get to, because I think it's important, is these 2 factors. One, because of the change in the administration and perceived winds of philosophy in the U.S., do we predict, and we'll start with news, do we predict that some of the challenges that news has faced in terms of leaning in and investing in news will change in 2025? And do you think as an industry, we will sort of step away from this concern that we can't have the brand advertising show up adjacent to whatever that story is of the day?
Yeah, I think this has been percolating for a long time, and obviously we all know the context is brand marketeers, because of brand safety, have tended to steer clear of news. Every piece of research that I've seen, that we've conducted, that other research firms suggest that in trusted and safe environments, juxtaposition of advertising against breaking news is not an issue. It doesn't impact brand. So we have to grow up. There is a large amount of audience there that is lucrative for brand marketeers, and we should lean into it. I think there is a bigger question. And of course, for all the other reasons, we want to fund trusted journalism, we want to fund, and we should, the advertising ecosystem funds a democratic, journalistic, trusted news environment, and we have to understand that we are part of that, and that is really important. So, but the second part of it, I think, is we're talking about a new regime, and certainly the issue of it might bleed across into brand safety issues. I think, it's just, I would divide it between bad agents, maybe in platforms versus trusted sources of journalism. Brian actually mentioned about 4 hours ago, Meta announced that they were actually doing away with third-party moderation. So I know that's big breaking news, and they're going to follow X. So you can obviously see a move. And I think what that's going to mean is we're going to have to re-review brand safety guidelines. But certainly when it comes to news, I'm hugely in favor of us talking to our brand marketeers, sitting down, using tried and true authentic research to actually prove and validate that it is that there isn't an issue about supporting trusted news.
Yeah, no, listen, I think the notion that brand advertisers aren't in news is a little bit overblown. I mean, if you take a look, and this is just Fox News, Fox News has on air 7, 8 out of the top 10 accounts in every single brand. Are they all at 9 o'clock in Sean Hannity? No, not necessarily. They vary throughout the network in different times, and some buy lifestyle content, some will buy hard news content. I'm actually incredibly encouraged because the trend we've seen, and I spent 20 years at CNN and now at Fox. The trend that I'm seeing is 15 years ago, when there was a big breaking news event, there was an immediate knee-jerk reaction for advertisers to pull out en masse. And now what I'm seeing is advertisers actually saying, no, wait a minute, these are important. These issues and these topics are important for the country to see, and we're going to show up there. And even during some of the most horrific breaking news events that we've seen over the last several years, we have not seen that pull out. And that's, honestly, it's very, very encouraging because it's a recognition from advertisers about the importance of covering these really important topics around the world.
My guess, if I may, my guess is that's you taking share, because I observe, which good for you, but I observe that marketers collectively, and independent of whether they should be supporting news, I would argue they should. All the reasons Paul said, I don't see it in terms of where the money's going. I'm just saying, I think money, the vast majority of marketers in this room might support the sentiments that Paul argued, but what they feel, what they say, what they do. And what they do, collectively marketers, is not supporting journalism right now, which is why I think the long term for journalism has to be subscriptions. And that has negative consequences too.
Well, I think there's a difference between digital and linear, right? And
you're taking share though.
So yeah, well, yes.
And
our audience is growing disproportionately, and that's why share is coming on over.
And I was going to say, right? Jeff, you're very focused on sort of the linear and even sort of, let's say, CTV. I don't think that the same level of brand safety and the automation of brand safety has taken place there. Those are big upfront deals. There's an expectation of spend. It's going to spend in those places. I think if you look at your equivalent in terms of your digital display spend on your news sites, where there's an automation of DV and IS blocking keywords against articles, I think there's an automation of blocking news because that's part of the OS. It's technologically implemented. It's not a choice of, hey, you've done it up front, you got to spend, and you're going to have this GRPs on these linear broadcast channels, and so therefore your commercials are going to run in these places.
Yeah, no, listen, I think it's, and I completely agree with you. It's different because then if you look at local news, and there's some horrific things that you'll see in local news, you'll see a lot of national advertisers that might not be in sort of national news too. But I think from a digital standpoint, you're absolutely right. I think the automation of it has led to an enormous amount of challenges and defunding a lot of news organizations that would be getting more.
So now, before we get to predictions, because we have 5 minutes, but before we get to predictions, let's quickly go down. How does the automation change is there going to be enforcement of a change of philosophy on the automation of blocking keywords? We saw what happened with GARM, where Elon Musk actually challenged GARM, brought a lawsuit. You see sort of legislative impacts where if you do nothing or if you continue to automate the blocking of things, it used to be you could do nothing. Now you may be hauled up in front of Congress as to why your philosophy is to block everything. Walk me through how that changes in 2025.
I just, I know we're running a bit out of time. I think it's a bigger issue. I think brands have to, I think under the new political environment, so that they don't end up as the hot potato, the hot potato, maybe brands might sit in the middle of this vortex of culture wars and or brand safety issues. And I think I think a lot of brands will go back to their boardroom and they will look very carefully at their CSR strategies. I think we will see a lot more apolitical. I don't think brands were necessarily in the business of being political, unless, of course, you're a political brand. But I think even more so, you need to be quite neutral in this great America. I think there will be much more of a focus on economic growth, people's growth, as opposed to politicized issues, culture wars and other. And yes, of course, I mean, it's going to filter down into blocking tactics, but that's the tactic. And of course, we'll have more AI tools at our disposal. But I think it's more about what is the nose cone of your strategy that leads to then the automation tactics underneath it. Because if you just rely on automation, you're going to be hauled in front. There's going to be that mistake that's going to catch you.
There's going to be accountability if you just automate blocking.
Yeah.
You heard it here first. Go ahead.
I think everything is political. The point is you can't not be political now. I mean, the fact is that, is democracy a good thing? That is a political statement. Full fact. I mean, that's reality. And we can all be pro or anti. It doesn't matter. But anyways, I would argue everything is political. Here's the question. I think that with automation of keyword blocking, I assume almost everyone here as a brand probably has a list of keywords that they block in some form. Who would be willing to let Jim Jordan read that full list, or his staff? And seriously, I mean, is there a show of hands? Would anyone who has a block list, would they be willing to let Jim Jordan's staff read that full list? Because I think that's where we're going. You need to be able to be prepared to have that leaked and be able to stand by why you have everything on that block list. And I think that's where we're going.
Jeff?
Again, those that were called in front of Jim Jordan were part of a brand safety organization, not individual advertisers being called out for spending.
Unilever was there.
And Unilever is part of GARM. Unilever is a founding member of GARM. That's why they were there. So no individual advertisers are being called out for where they're spending or not spending. I just want that to be very clear. I think the challenge with brand safety is that there's no perfect situation and no perfect solution on the automated front, and then the more subjective front has its own set of challenges with unconscious bias, where some of these organizations are doing, again, more sort of subjective grading of news overall too. So somehow there has to be some sort of melding of the two, but we haven't seen a perfect solution yet at this point.
Okay, so this is the last thing, and then we're going to go. You got one prediction, one sentence for 2025.
Okay, there are two, when it comes to predictions, there are two kinds of people. Those that don't know, and those that don't know they don't know. And I've been in both camps. So I'm being I've actually reflected back. But I was going to talk about AI, and personalization, and then the backlash to personalization. I was going to talk about, the maturation of influencers and the backlash of influencers, and us looking for trusted sources like our neighbors and our friends and family. And, maybe the counter view would be that a lot of incumbent media is going to be under pressure. But actually, I think there could be a renaissance for incumbent media, because as we look for trusted sources, so there's all these contradictions that are going to go on. But I want to keep my eye on the ball because we're at CES. Firstly, I think it's be careful of fads, okay? Be careful of the hype cycle of fads. Just understand that we need to be consistent, and the life cycle of real, truly innovative technologies that enhance people's lives take quite a while.
Okay, be careful of fads.
CNN gets spun off.
CNN gets spun off.
Wow. The rate of cord cutting decelerates this year because of new options for consumers, like what Charter's doing with adding streaming into packages and new skinnier bundles that are out there.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, the panel.
All right, guys.